I heard yesterday was very clear that the department really needed to take a close look at some of the requirements, specifically things like requiring all 8 areas for all students, and how is that really considering students' individual pathways beyond high school, and secondly, to have something other than a certificate of completion as the other option for students who go through high school and don't hit the bar of proficiency in all of the proficiency area or required proficiencies. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves, but I wanted you to just know that this was out and what I think it means, and I think that I'm hopeful that we'll see some movement on those 2 issues in particular. I'd say the third thing that came up in the group I was in is the issue of equity around the whole diploma, certificate of completion, and the disparity that creates, especially with students who have learning challenges, and some real concern around that. So Sharon had been in some meetings where she heard some similar kind of feedback about this reset and what it means and kind of what it's based upon. So do you have any questions about that?
This is Brian. I had a question. I guess it's maybe, so I hear that this is a positive step to stop and think about some of the ramifications. But just reading the tea leaves, either if the governor changes or just national trends in education, do we feel like it's pretty certain that proficiency-based diplomas are still going to be the big push 2 years from now, or is there a chance that this is really just going to completely kind of drift away as the issues start to come up?
You know, that's really, I really can't answer that, and I don't really have a good read on the future of this, given potential changes in state leadership. So I don't know if Reg and others would have a different answer than that. But, you know, for right now, we have 9th graders sitting in classes who are under this requirement statutorily. So we have to move forward as we've planned, which I think is a very measured kind of approach to this. I think the high school and Reg has been very careful to not get out ahead of this in a way that would cause them to have to pull back some of the features at this point. With any change that comes, I think we're in a good position to not have to make significant changes to what's being done, at least at this point. But it would really be reading tea leaves at this point, which I am not comfortable even guessing at.
I guess part of why I ask is these issues that are coming up. I mean, they were obvious 2 years ago. We were talking about them at board meetings 2 years ago. So I guess, yeah, I just can't get a read on where people's heads are at the state in terms of how they're trying to treat this whole thing.
Well, it seemed in the meeting yesterday that the state is still the state as the staff and the leadership now is very supportive and very committed to this. But as you pointed out, it's hard to know what might happen on a number of fronts, frankly, if there's a change in leadership, significant, change in thought with next leadership. But I don't know.
Fair enough. We're in a good place for now, like you said, so that's the best we can do.
Yeah. Any other questions?
All right, I think we're on to discussion items. First of which is presentation and assessment of NWEA data.
So I sent board members the fall data from our NWEA administration, and what we first of all, just to mention that Ms. Fournier, Mr. Kinney, and myself sat down and kind of looked at all the reports that we have as options and looked at and really considered where is our focus right now in terms of using this data. And the reports we provided are really where the fall focus is in looking at NWEA. It's the time of year where teachers are, you know, in a data collection mode about their students to really determine instructional needs for pacing, for intervention, for groupings. And this is the kind of information that they need. And there are lots of ways they can dig deeper into this when they want to know more. But in terms of kind of an initial look, this is what they start with. Although we've given you grade level reports, and teachers start with class level reports that look just like this and have student detail actually that follows this overall summary chart. So the board, as I sat through meetings last spring, I know there was lots of discussion about NWEA and what information you like to see and where you want us to place our focus. And I heard loud and clear that was on growth. And growth is absolutely something where we want to put our focus. But in the fall, the growth data at that point has somewhat limited use. And spring is the time to be looking at growth reports to really consider if we've met growth targets for students over the course of the year, both individual students and then groups of students and grade levels and schools. So that would be the time where we would bring, for example, the quadrant charts that you like to look at, the quadrant growth charts that you like to review around growth. So what I provided today is more of what's called the static, on the static report side. That's not looking at growth. So it's looking at each subject tested across the grades 2 through 8 and giving some comparative information and then some breakdown within each subject of the different subtests or strands, or they call them goal areas in the MAP tests. So some general observations that we had about this is that while all grades and subjects show the grade level mean as being above nationally normed grade level means, that's not the bar or yardstick that we need to be using, as I think this board has pointed out. If we are just trying to hit that bar, then we're really under having lower expectations than is really appropriate for our population. So, but at a minimum, that's the first thing we just take a look at it to make sure that there's not an unexpected dip in that regard. And then we begin looking at some of the features that you see on here. And as the principals and I looked at this, we began to see some places where we see some opportunities and where we see some instructional kind of concern areas or areas where teachers are going to need to focus some time and energy around how to respond to the student needs that they might have in their class, as shown by the grade level data anyway. So just to kind of, I don't know if you want, I have some observations about each grade level that are more general in nature. And again, similar to the conversation or the comment I had about the math placement, you know, if we want to get into any greater detail or questioning about any particular grade, given some of the, you know, low student counts in some of these performance areas, I think it would be best to not speak of those details publicly, but certainly we can talk in general terms about what we see on these charts. Second grade is really interesting. As we looked at second grade, one of the things that that I learned is that previous to this year, and not if I'm saying this right or wrong, please, Ms. Werner, that second grade was giving the MAP for primary grades version of the test. So at each level, there are actually 3 levels of the MAP test. There's a K through 2 level that's called MPG, MAP for primary grades. There is a 2 through 5, grade 2 through 5 level test. And then there's the 6 and up level test. And so second grade is a grade where you can really choose which way you're going to go, which test you're going to use. And in the past, they've used MPG. This year, used the 2 through 5 test. And so we've talked about actually having a more differentiated approach than that. NWEA actually publishes a threshold that once a student hits a certain score, that's the time to consider moving that particular child up to the 2 through 5 tests. So I think we're going to experiment with that moving forward and talk with the teachers about it anyway and see if they like that approach. It's a little bit more complicated on the setup side because you have to differentiate which test is assigned to which child, but I think in the end the data that we get might be better instructional information for our teachers to use during that year. That's if you move them up too soon, it can give you some information that might not be presenting a accurate picture, and similarly if you leave them in the MPG too long. So that was probably one of our biggest conversation pieces around the second grade data. And really it started because second grade looks different than, say, if you look at some of the other grade levels where the blue and green, for example, looks smaller on some of these second grade charts than the other grades. And we started looking at that and talking about why that is. And they went up to the more rigorous test this year. So. Okay.
We did math this year.
MPG, primary. So this was the K through 2 one this year. I'm sorry, I got that backwards when I said that. Yeah, so it's reverse what I just said. So this is the MPG.
I couldn't hear what Darcy just said. Could you repeat it?
Yeah, so basically reverse what I just said. I had it backwards, that previous to this year we'd given the 2 through 5, and this year they changed to the MPG, the map for primary grades.
Which is K through 2?
Yeah, so they're doing, everyone's taking the same test though in second grade. So what we're looking at doing is a more differentiated approach.
And this test they took this year is the harder or the easier? I'm sorry, I'm having...
It's the easier.
Okay.
It's the easier. And, you know, so it's interesting to me to see the charts given that. Like the language chart is one in particular, that language isn't you know, comparatively shows a lot more need compared to the reading and math. And I think that the teachers had some comments about that when Darcy started to meet with them, which she's already started to have grade level meetings with these teachers around the data. So second grade, I think, is something we need to study a little more and figure out the right direction to go. But
I just have one point of clarification on that. One of the things that jumped out to me as I went through this were the second grade language usage chart. Is what you're saying, that might be an artifact of changing the test, or we don't know?
well, I think that I don't have an answer why language is lower than reading and math. I don't think that in itself is because of a change from one to the other, because we gave the same, you know, version to all kids.
Okay.
So but the difference is actually when you look at these is that the language test, sorry, yeah, you want to come up? The language test is not a part of the MPG suite.
Okay.
So the MPG tests, if you look at the top where it says growth, math K through 2, reading K through 2. So the language, am I right, Darcy? There's not an MPG component test.
Right.
So they had to give the 2 through 12 test. Yeah.
As far as I understand, and the difference is that the MPG ones are read to the students. So they listen to the directions, they listen to all of that. I believe the language one was not that format.
So for math and reading, it was a K2 test, but for language, it's a grade 2 through 12 test.
Right. It still responds to their their answers and differentiates based on their progress. But my understanding is that because it's read to them, it's less of an independent level.
Okay.
So, and that's why it doesn't,
So it could be a testing artifact.
could be. Which is why we're talking about starting to differentiate at the second grade level. Some students could demonstrate independently that the same level or higher score independently, whereas others need it read to them to be successful.
That wouldn't help for this language test, though.
Exactly.
Because that's only available as a 212.
Right, right. And so we're talking about transitioning students depending on whether they can perform the test or demonstrate their knowledge independently without it being read to them, versus do they need the questions read to them to accurately to be able to present what they know. Right. That's kind of where we left off.
Thank you for that clarification, Darcy. So, you know, one of the things that we talked about is, you know, let's say 50% of the second grade class is ready for the second grade and up test, and then the rest need to stay in MPG. Does it make sense to give the language test in second grade? Or is that something we want to defer to start in third grade if you're not going to have all students taking it? So those are some conversations we need to have around considering what we're going to do with the second grade assessment. So, in science, you know, they didn't take science in second grade. They felt in the past like that data really was not valuable. This year?
They took it, but there's no norm.
Okay, that's the thing. There's no norm on that, so we didn't pull that information because there's no context for those scores across the performance levels here. So it gives an individual student RIT score, but not a percentile score, and doesn't help us with kind of knowing groupings and where students would fall on a continuum. So in third grade, this is when we start, at Asa Adams anyway, 3rd through 5th takes math, reading, literacy, and science all in the grades 2 through 5 test. And in third grade, we noted that ELA shows kind of more diverse learners, really, as a grade level. And we see a greater need there to close an achievement gap with some students, with a larger group of students compared to the math performance on these scores. And as I recall, that matches some of our MEA findings as well from the Empower test. And so when we put all this together to kind of look at the December report, I think we're going to see some trends like that across both of these tests, and we certainly see it in this grade. In 4th grade,
Meredith, can I
yes,
interrupt you for just a second?
certainly.
My sense is that the Lucy Calkins program, I think we talked about this before, doesn't talk about language usage, or does it? I was just wondering if you could comment on sort of the language curriculum and if it's emphasizing the language usage part.
I think I would have to talk with some of our elementary teachers to have a really thorough answer on that, but the Calkins curriculum really focuses on you know, several types of writing over the course of the year, and certainly there are embedded in that some language lessons and components more in a mini lesson format, but I don't think that it's really a scope and sequenced out kind of approach to teaching language in that program. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Darcy, if you have anything other different to say about that, certainly speak. Okay. So in 4th grade, one of the things we noted is that as a grade level, this group shows kind of to have more students in larger numbers with some learning needs. when you look at the charts compared to other grade levels. And I think that matches what our teachers are seeing and responding to in classrooms, and just really working to differentiate and provide some support for students to bring them up in areas where they're finding they need some additional instruction. So, and really it follows across all of the, just scanning through all of the subject areas in 4th grade, where, you know, and looking at the colors on the charts, which is one of the first places my eye goes, it's a very different pattern of, you know, the blue, green, yellow, orange, red in 4th grade compared to other grades. So that really has some instructional implications for our staff. And according to what I remember Ms. Fournier saying, that's something that this test was not a surprise. The results were not a surprise to them. It kind of matches what they had been seeing as they learned about their students in class. And then in grade 5,
Can we go back on grade 4? There's 2 language arts and literacy maps. I'm just not sure.
It was probably just copied in the packet.
One says 2 through 12 and one says 2 through 5. Oh, reading and language.
There's a reading one and a language.
Oh, that's okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
So for grade 5, we noted that we have a really large group of students in that blue and green, in those blue and green tiers. And then, you know, less than that, you know, smaller than that group, a section of pretty diverse learners. That's a real kind of logistical and planning challenge for our teachers, to be sure you're challenging these learners who are ready for so much acceleration and curriculum compacting, and then you have, you know, learners who have some real gaps that need to be filled. So 5th grade is an interesting study as you look at these numbers, and presents kind of a similar but different challenge from the grade level we just looked at. So this is a group that I think shows a need to do a lot of acceleration with the students in large numbers. And then the other groups, certainly some, as I said, some working on gaps and achievement in areas where they're showing some need to catch up or to improve their learning. So any overall comments about 2 through 5 before we transition to 6 through 8? One of the things that we talked about as we were looking at these is we just kind of talked about the kinds of things that both Darcy and Heath are working with their teachers on. I know Darcy mentioned she'd been having some meetings last week. Heath's been having some meetings this week. And just some of the features of these that I look at and what those features mean, like looking at standard deviation, and to a teacher, you know, what does that tell them in terms of their instructional planning, and what does that help them know about their group? And so that's something I know that both Heath and Darcy were going to, you know, take back to their teachers and look at that. And that's one of the things I think that I picked up probably when I was working for NWA for a while is I think that a lot of teachers just maybe don't look at that standard deviation column as much. They focus on the graph, the RIT score, and the percentile. But the standard deviation really gives the teacher a really good indication of how diverse this group is in their learning in a particular area or in a particular grade level or subject. So those are the kinds of things that I hope we can just begin to plant more and more seeds with people to really feel comfortable with and see value in this information for their instructional planning.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear you pointed that out, because I mean, I was looking at these standard deviations, and some of them are relatively small, you know, in the range of 8, 9, or 10, but then there's others that are 17,
20.
18, 20, and that's a huge standard deviation, and that is valuable information, so I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. Yeah. So in transitioning up to look at middle school, as a group, we see that reading performance looks slightly higher than the math performance in terms of overall where students are in terms of the students who are at the higher end of the achievement continuum. But I would say that, you know, this overall is a very diverse group of learners. When you look at, you know, the number of students and the size of the bands in each of those performance categories. So they're showing to have a very diverse set of learning needs for those teachers. And when you begin to go up, it's not really as true on this 7th grade math as I see it on other ones, but the 7th grade math actually shows a really higher number of kind of that low to average set of bands than we see in some other grade levels. So similar to the 6th grade, just have a pretty, not quite even distribution, but more even than we see in some other grades across those performance categories. But if you take out math and look at the others, as you move up these grade levels, and then when you get to 8th, it really shows a trend toward, you know, students really improving their performance overall as a grade level. And, you know, by the time you get to the 8th grade reports, if you started down at those 2nd grade reports and start working up, you're like, wow, look at all this blue and green compared to, you know, what we've seen along the way. And I haven't studied the data here for long enough to know if that's kind of what we would see over time. But I think it says really positive things about the instructional program we have students in over time and the progress they're making. So that we're growing those groups of students who are in the top 2 tiers of performance on here over the grade spans. So we certainly see, you know, 7th grade math shows some really some diverse learning needs. But I just have to say, science, when you get up, and I think it's 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, really, and I think going down into elementary school also, the performance is just really strong. And I think it's a credit to our science curriculum we have in place and the time that students get science instruction beginning in later middle school grades. There really is especially a comparative strength compared to certainly the national norms. That's, I think, something to take note of and to commend our teachers in our schools. So did you have any other questions or areas you wanted to discuss on this at this point?
I guess I just had a comment. I mean, I noticed what you were saying about science too, so that's great. Seems to me that in general, across, I don't know quite what to make of language arts because it disappears in 6th grade and, you know, 2nd grade's a little bit questionable and so forth. But seems like pretty broadly we're better in reading than math, so that just kind of makes me excited that we decided to, I don't know how much, I'm sure that's attributable to a lot of things, but I have to assume part of that is to the reading intervention specialists that we have. So I think it's kind of a good thing that we've decided to try that out in the math area as well, because that seems to be a very general pattern.
Well, it's interesting because I think in the elementary grade levels, for the most part, we actually see kind of lower data numbers and performance in reading, but when it gets to middle school, it flips. So it's really quite interesting. As you say, we have, you know, a lot of support for reading in the elementary grade levels, but I think our learners there, and Sharon could probably speak to this also, we have a pretty high percentage of students who have some real learning needs around reading and literacy in the elementary grades right now that I'd have to look back more historically to know if that is in the data further back, the kind of lower reading and higher math, but it's something we noted in the MEA scores at the Asa Adams level, and then when you get to middle school, it kind of you know, reversed that trend. So it'll be interesting to study that up against the MEA data when we look at that together in December.
I just wanted to say thanks to you and to the principals for putting this together and walking us through your observations.
Sure. And the other thing I forgot to respond to with what you said, Brian, is we're having some discussion at the middle school about the language test because, as you mentioned, it drops off after 5th grade in terms of our use of it. And it's still there. It's something available to us. And historically, I'm told that it was taken out at a time when there was some concern about the amount of time spent in assessment. And I think some people question the value of that information from the language test. But Heath and I have talked about kind of starting that conversation. We're going to start it with our English teachers tomorrow, actually, and talk about if it makes sense to bring that back into the testing suite. Because we're paying for it, we have it, it's just whether or not we want to use it.
Yeah, that makes sense. That sounds like a good conversation to have. Just kind of echoing Michelle, just in general, I feel like this district is in a totally different place than we were 2 or 3 years ago in terms of being proactive about getting test scores and analyzing them and using them. So I think that's a great thing to see. I'm really happy to see that, and thank you to everybody who's making that happen.
Yes, and I know that the principals are really interested in working with their staff on this and growing in, you know, everyone's comfort with the data and how to use it and make it meaningful. So I think there aren't many boards who look at data in the way that you do, but I think it has provided leadership for the district to, you know, push ourselves maybe in this regard. So I think we have a good start this year with it.
Does anyone have anything else on this topic? All right. So next is update on state budget regionalization requirements.
So this might fall under the same line of questioning that Brian had earlier about what I predict the tea leaves to say in a couple of years around this, but it's our current reality that I want to share with you. You may recall that when the budget was passed on July, was it 3rd this year? There was some language in the budget around system administration that was one of the most controversial parts of the budget reform that the governor had put forward this year. And in what was actually passed, there was language that seemed to have some strings around that after this fiscal year. And we didn't understand a lot about what that meant until recently when information started to come forward about the stipulations that were going to be placed on at least a portion of that money moving forward. So I've been to a training session on this and heard the commissioner speak somewhat on this at a Penquist superintendent's meeting. So I've given you just a couple of documents that I think summarize the stipulations, and I guess I'd like you to look at the last page first. That kind of shows you the penalty, so to speak, if you do not comply with this regional service center approach. So the 16-17 school year in our allocation, we received $233 per pupil for system administration. And this year's budget, when it was first presented back in February, it was down at zero. So there was no allocation in that particular bucket of funding. And then when the budget got passed, it was at $135 per student. So, you know, I'm not a politician, but I recognize politics at work, and it seemed like, you know, at $135 at that point we felt grateful to get it. So it was an effective strategy, I suppose. So moving forward, you see that next year for the fiscal year, I guess that will be FY19 budget. Yeah, we're in FY18 right now. the total allocation per pupil is $138 per student, but to qualify for $46 of that, you have to meet the requirements of the regional service centers guidelines I'll talk about in a second. And then in 2019-20 fiscal year, that increases to $94 as a penalty of your allocation under system administration. So certainly increasing penalties with not participating in a regional service center. For us next year, if we don't do a regional service center meeting the guidelines they've put out, it will be a reduction of $37,000 in our allocation, and then the next year it would be a reduction of $76,000 in our allocation. So just to kind of explain a little bit about what this is, it's the governor / commissioner now redo on regionalization initiatives and really pushing for regionalization. And what they are requiring for districts to do is to work with other districts and create regional programming or services to have more efficiency and cost savings. So to qualify to get your targeted allocation, you have to be participating in 2 regional service centers in at least 2 different categories. So you see here there are 4 categories that have been identified. Instructional services is the category. Category 2, educational support services. Category 3, central office services. And category 4 is facilities and transportation system services. And so we would have to participate in at least 2 across at least 2 different categories. I can say one of the things that most of the people I've talked to about this and that I work with in the Pequot region we're all pretty frustrated about is we've been doing some of these things for a number of years. The Spruce program that I think it's been in existence for, since the 80s. I don't know exactly when it started, but a long time ago at this point. PrEP is another example of a regionalization for professional development. So we have some of these in place already that certainly qualify under this caveat, under these categories, but because they're already in place, we can't use those to say.
We can't meet category 1 already, even though we have at least 2 of those things.
Right, we would have to create something new. Or other things they've said is you'd have to dissolve that and kind of reinvent it, which kind of defies logic. So we would have to add a substantial new component to, for example, Spruce. We'd have to add a substantial new component to Spruce for that to count. And that program actually just added a component for this school year, using some of the regionalization grants that came out last spring to be a model for regionalization. So even though, this region got ahead, kind of, went forward with regionalization, created a model program, we don't get to use that for this. So there's a fair bit of discontent around that. So I would say the other big thing that I've learned about this, and the first workshop I went to was done by Drummond and Woodson, and it's interesting that Drummond and Woodson had to come out in front and kind of give the information to people in front of the DOE being ready to do that. But one thing they said, based on their reading of the law, is to proceed with caution, to be very cautious about jumping into these, because there is language in the statute that there are penalties for leaving a regional service center, that you are not allowed to leave a regional service center once you enter it unless it can be demonstrated that your district's leaving does not place a increased financial burden on the member districts, which if you have fewer people contributing to the initiative, you're going to have increased costs in that center. So basically they've said, be sure that, doing this for your $37,000 is worth it, because it's like a marriage with no divorce option, they said, are, you know, very limited divorce options, because they don't want for people to join these and then just get out of them as soon as possible. They have some really strong language around penalties for that. And then the other thing is that there are a lot of people who are really think this is a way of moving forward an agenda around reducing the number of superintendents, this whole concept of having an executive director. You have to have an executive director in a regional service center. So for right now, for example, Spruce, that's been around for over 30 years, has never had an executive director, doesn't have that kind of cost in its administration, but this has a requirement for that. So the whole idea of an executive director is an interesting little caveat they've thrown in there. So I think as I learn more about it, I'll definitely share that with you, and I think we will have to determine if opportunities that come to us or come before us are something that makes sense for us to do. And I would almost like to use the lens, would this be something we would consider without this penalty? Because as Brian pointed out earlier, it's hard to know the changes that can happen in a couple of years. And, you know, I think this district has gone down a road before of trying to adhere to state requirements around regionalization and ending up in a place where things weren't working as well as they hoped. So I would say we would proceed with caution with this. And I'm hearing there's some new emergency legislation that may come out toward the end of this month that would repeal certain parts of this. So we'll see where that goes. Do you have any questions about this or anything that I didn't give you the full information? I have more if you want to read it. I'll certainly provide anything I have.
I just had a quick question. I'm, you know, this is an outsider perspective, but looking through these lists, some of the things seem easier than others to do. This is just from reading it. I mean, is there a sense that you could check off two of these in fairly easier ways than others, or is that not really being discussed yet?
It's definitely being discussed, and we've, as a Penquist group of superintendents, or more, probably smaller than that, probably the prep region superintendents, have had some discussion around which of these might be easier for us to accomplish and be something that we could more, as a region, agree on and come together on. Things like transportation would be really difficult to do in short order. Because this requires, you know, interlocal agreements, and you have to take this before voters. I mean, there's a whole process that has to happen around this. But yeah, things like we looked at the substitute teacher kind of pool and centralizing that service. That's one that certainly on the surface seems to be an easier thing to accomplish. I think what we have to think about is what sacrifices around kind of local control and choice and selection are we willing to accept to do that? Because I think you make some sacrifices when you do something like that.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but under a situation like that with the substitute teacher, we'd be getting sent subs that weren't, it'd be like a pool of subs, and someone within that pool who's not in our district is assigning, is basically finding subs for your district. Is that right? I mean, you're right. If that's the case, it totally takes away the local control.
Yeah, well, I guess I would compare that to when I've worked in large school districts in Florida where you have centralized sub-assignment systems for a school district that had 35 schools in it. And the district where I worked last in Florida, that was what the district had gone to in the last 5 or so years. But prior to that, it was each school, each teacher kind of securing their own subs. And there definitely was a cost to giving up that sense of control of, I have a good relationship with these 5 subs and they know my classroom, they know my students, I want to have one of them when I'm out. compared to a more centralized kind of system. So yes, it definitely, you lose some of the choice and the control over things like that.
I had a couple of thoughts and comments. I mean, first, that was a really good overview. Thank you. I don't know. The one thing I want to point out on that last page, the biggest drop is actually from 2016-17 to 2017-18, right? We lost $100 per student just for not even doing anything, just for, you know, whatever out of the negotiations of the. So there's clearly an attack on central administration, and it's very, as Meredith said, it's very hard to know how that's going to go down. But if you looked at the papers this last year, I was kind of the very last give that the Democrats made, you know, when this was being bargained. So I think there's a real chance this could be revisited this spring, and there's a real chance this could be revisited next year. So kind of aside from the Drummond and Woodson, you're never getting divorced, you know, the whole ground, much more than something like PBE. I think there's a very real chance the whole ground could be shifting. So I agree with Meredith's caution that, you know, $37,000 is not nothing, but we already took the biggest hit. We already lost $100 per student, and that's part of a big piece of what happened to us on the tax front this year. Just out of the negotiations, not out of anything we did or didn't choose to do about regionalization, and that hit is built into the schedule forever. That's not going to go away or change. So, I mean, I look at this like in a big business, is this something you centralize or don't centralize? And I've worked in places with centralized, just to pick on accounting, for example, centralized accounting, and it is not a responsive system. There's no way it could be. They're almost all, or IT, those are all things that you want to have responsive and local. So it doesn't strike me that there's a lot of obvious wins. You know, food service, Orno is always talking about wanting to do food service differently. It's very hard to find a win in here where we're immediately obviously wanting to turn over local control. So given the no divorce and the fact that, I don't know, 50-50, this is all going to change next year or the year after that, I definitely think a go slow approach is the right way to go.
Yeah,
Do you have any thoughts from, I know you followed the political process closely, and do you have any thoughts about this in terms of change?
Well, I mean, I think I would agree with your thoughts and what Meredith outlined initially, is that my strong suggestion would be to approach this extremely cautiously, because we are going to have legislative elections, gubernatorial election, obviously, where the incumbent is prevented by term limits from running. There is a very good chance, as you pointed out, that this could look very different. A year from now, 18 months from now, it could even be as little as 3 or 4 months from now, depending on what gets clearance from legislative council to be brought up in the next legislative session. So I think I think the absolute right approach is to go cautiously on this right now and don't jump into anything. I looked over the list as well, and I don't see anything that's just easily done, that's a clear positive, and just kind of wait it out and see where things settle. But trying to predict how that's going to play out right now would be difficult, if not impossible, to do. So I just think kind of holding tight's the way to go.
Well, I will keep you posted as I learn more, and I think I will actually hear more about this later this week at a Penquist superintendent's meeting. So I'll pass things along as I learn of them myself.
All right, anything else on this subject? All right, seeing nothing, we're on to action items, and the first is staff nominations. And I will read the list of nominations. So for varsity swimming, we have Gary Theriault. For assistant varsity swimming at a .48, we have Mackenzie Hansen. Assistant varsity swimming at a .52, Carrie Dexter. Varsity cheering for the winter, Heather Tupper. Boys varsity basketball, Jason Coleman. Boys JV basketball, Matt Murray. Girls JV basketball, Derek Sinclair. Nordic skiing, .5, Sid Dijek. Nordic skiing, .5, Ann Ross. Ice hockey, Orno Old Town. This one would be with Old Town, Dennis Collins. Assistant ice hockey from Old Town, Chris Thurlow. Indoor track, Chris Libby. Assistant varsity indoor track, Miguel Caballero. And assistant varsity indoor track, Tyler White. So if I have the process correctly, I will make a nomination for the approval of the slate of these positions, and then I'd need a second.
I second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? All right, so next we're on to ABS Inc., the Atlantic Behavior Service.
So this is the contract for, one of the contracts that Sharon has in place for services around behavior consultation and assessment. And this is not a new, we've been working with this company for 10 years. Thank you, Sharon. And we're bringing it to you due to the amount of the contract. You can see the hourly rates, and then the ceiling of the contract being $35,000 for the school year. Do you have any questions?
Sharon, can you just explain
Up front, Sharon.
briefly what this is, what we get for this, what they provide?
We have two contracts, one that you approved last August, and this one for board-certified behavior analysts. They're specialists who come in with students who have significant behavioral needs, analyze the function of the behavior, and help create a behavior plan that addresses those. They're most frequently used with children who have diagnoses, for example, of autism.
Is the one we did back in August, is that the OT one?
The second, yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Yep, so we would need a motion for the approval of the contract with ABS.
So moved.
And I will second. Is there any further discussion? All those in favor? All right, thank you. All right, so next we're on to facilities discussion, specifically the composition of the committee.
So you see before you the draft of the facilities committee. I took your feedback, the brief from our last meeting. It was gave me some just different ideas to think about around, especially size. Talked with the administrative team. Brian and I have spent a good amount of time talking about this and bring to you this recommendation you see before you tonight. So the composition that you see, there are some people who are already named, but the large majority are still to be announced, to be determined. We're still looking for another representative from the board here to fill the second board seat. And then we're recommending 3 teacher representatives, thinking 1 per building to kind of bring perspectives from all buildings. The 2 support staff representatives, just wanting to really have a couple of different, hopefully, job roles that can be represented on the committee from the support staff realm, since they make up nearly 50% of the school staff. Have a student representative seat, and then 3 seats for parent or community members. One thing I failed to say, especially for those of you at home, the other seats would be filled by myself, our facilities director, Brent Fournier, the 3 principals, and then Brian McGill has volunteered to be the other board member. So that comes up to a recommendation for a panel of 16, which is quite a bit more than I initially was thinking. And really, Brent and I met yesterday with our architect, the lead architect on the PDT team. And, you know, we just talked about purpose of this committee in a facility study and how is that different than purpose of a committee during a building. You know, they work with a lot of districts that are in building projects. So really, input in a facility study is one of the most important aspects for them to make sure they're giving back to us something that's responsive to our both, you know, obvious needs from their observation, but also what they hear. So in addition to the components of the process that will involve kind of forums where people can come out and be involved, I think this is one of the other main opportunities for them to learn about us and to hear from us to create a study that is responsive to our needs. So I came around to the idea of a larger committee. And the process for selection that I'm recommending, obviously the board seat would just be probably if we can get another volunteer. And then for the student representative, I'm suggesting that to see if we have a volunteer from our student board reps. And if they can't commit to that, then we'll have to talk about another way. Or if they can't commit to that, do we want to not have a student representative on the group? We can talk about that. And then for the teachers, support staff, parent, community, a short application process that kind of mirrors what Brian said that the board did around the superintendent search committee. And I've just outlined a few questions we might include on that. So, Brian, would you add anything to that overview?
No, I think that's completely on target. I'll just kind of emphasize that when I first looked at this, my reaction was, oh my goodness, we have to get this down to 12 or 13. But the more I thought about the function, this is the big picture overview. And the decisions are going to be the hard, it's not a decision about where the drinking fountains go, right? These are the big level decisions about what gets bonded, what gets sent on an application for state funds, what doesn't get built. So it's very much going to be the board and the administrative team that's owning these decisions. So this is not a decision-making group. This is really a communication, transparency, filtering and prioritizing input, and then feeding information back to the community. And in that function, I think, I think this was basically Meredith's original proposal. I think she was right on target that we really need to have a very diverse and fairly large group to meet that function of information flow, which is the main purpose I see for this group. So after having a big gulp, I actually came around to the idea that this is just about the right number of people and the right composition of people.
So, Brian and Meredith, are you looking for any action from us in the form of a motion where we approve the skeletal structure of this, or what are you looking for?
So, Jake, traditionally, I think we have had a motion about the composition and process of the group. And then, of course, we have the applications, and probably would discuss that in executive session. So, yeah, I think a motion on the slots, not the people, but the slots and the process would be a good thing to do.
Okay, so I will make a motion for the approval of the skeletal structure of the composition of this committee.
And the process.
Yes, and the process, yep.
I'll second that.
Any discussion?
I just wanted to make sure, I know you talked about the student representative, but I feel like the parent and community that should be opened up more so that there might be a student out there, because I know Becca has a lot of things probably on her plate, so does Ben, but to someone who's really interested in this process, that we open it up a little bit and get applications to see.
I mean, these questions could certainly be applied to a student representative as well, and that's really up to your feedback as to which direction we go with that.
I mean, I guess my thought on that would be to make the spot available to our current student reps if they wanted it. But if neither Becca nor Ben had the time or the interest or the availability, then open it up, so I don't know if we want to, I mean, obviously, we can't put Ben on the spot, well, we could. You do that to people all the time, but give them responsibilities when they don't attend meetings, but we won't do that.
He's at a soccer game.
So we won't do that.
Soccer game.
So I don't think we can ask them that now, but maybe we could put language in to say that slot, first priority goes to one of the current student reps, and if neither of them are available, then the student applications will follow the application process as outlined in here. And so that way they're off the hook, but if they want to be on the hook, they can put themselves there.
I just want to make sure that we get a student rep who,
Yes, oh, I
who
agree,
has.
absolutely.
So you have first refusal.
I have a couple of other suggestions, well, one comment and a couple of suggestions as well for the language before we vote on it. One, I guess the comment is that I'm a smaller committee kind of guy, but I think in this case, the size it's at is perfectly fine. In fact, I could think of a couple of other slots that I'd put in there. I'm going to refrain from that, but I think it's fine as it is, so I think that's good. In terms of the actual language, I do think it would be a good idea to specify that the 3 teacher slots are to be made up of 1 from each school. It doesn't specify that right now, so I'd specify that. And then the other thing I'd want to specify, and Brian mentioned this, is under the second bullet point for the application process, applications due by November 1st and will be considered by the board in executive session at the November 7th board meeting. I wouldn't want to put any applicants or have any applicants worry that the applications they submit are going to be discussed in a public session, that'll be done in executive session. So if anybody's concerned about that, that's addressed in the process. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Any other discussion? All right, all those in favor? Okay.
So just to summarize, I'm going to put this out via email, website, and on the Friends of Orono Schools listserv. And we'll probably try to do this maybe through a Google form where people can just complete the form and answer the questions to submit an application. So does that sound like a good format for that? Okay.
All right, so now we're on to policies, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, amendments and second readings we have the ability to approve tonight if we so choose, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
You could potentially do that for all 3 of these.
Okay, so we will start with KCD, which is public gifts.
So just the quick background. The version of this policy that we had, I don't know, 3-4 years ago did have a $500 cutoff, and somehow through the process of repealing and putting in new policies, we lost that $500 cutoff. So this is returning the $500 cutoff, except in cases where there is a clear concern about future maintenance costs or safety concerns. And it also just adds the idea that anything over $100 would get notified to the board for acknowledgement by the board.
All right, so I will make a motion for the approval of KCD.
I second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? All right, next is DN, disposal of school property.
So this one did not historically have a $500 cutoff. In fact, I'm not sure that we really practiced this policy until we put it into place about a year ago. But it seems to me a $500 cutoff would be appropriate. Get rid of things worth a couple $100 with their best judgment. And that seemed to be the consensus when I took instruction from the board. So just got that one small change.
Quick question, in A, where it says all member municipalities are to be informed in writing of property declared surplus, and it is to have first option to purchase for any item of over 5,000, should it match the 500 above, or is it meant to be 5,000? I'm a little confused by that.
5,000 is what was in the original MSMA default policy. I think they're envisioning things like trucks and snowplows, fairly large ticket items.
Okay. All right, so I will make a motion for the approval of DN.
I second.
Is there any discussion? All those in favor? All right, last is the second reading of GCQC, resignation of school employees.
So we read this back in June, so that's why this is the second reading. We discussed this at the last board meeting, took it to the policy subcommittee meeting. I think the admin team and Meredith were all happy with this. Mark had two little corrections that you see that I think are both from a strict technical legal point, good changes, and that's the state of the policy that you see before you now. And again, the bigger background is we were recommended by our lawyer that we should enable the superintendent to accept resignations so that they can happen quicker. Sometimes that's legally a good thing to do.
All right, so I will make a motion for the acceptance of GCQC.
I second.
Is there any discussion?
I have a quick question. If you accept resignations, will they still be announced at a board meeting?
Yeah, that's the last sentence.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, that
I mean,
last sentence. So, just for clarification, this would be for all classifications of employees, we would announce resignations?
Yeah, I think so. We haven't had a really standard practice. We've done all teachers and some staff and not some staff. But I think the way this is worded as employees, it would probably be all staff. And, you know, if we've had longtime staff, it'd be nice for the board to be able to recognize their departure as well.
All right, any other discussion?
Just one edit and then one question. We need a period at the end of that first paragraph. And then second, the question, does it matter at all that the heading on this says first reading when it's really a second? Brian.
I did look it up in the agenda. We definitely did a first read back in June, so.
I know it is a second read.
Precedence over what it says in the
Okay,
document.
fair enough. Thank you.
Do you have a date on that, Angie? Do you know the date of the first reading for the, we'll have to go back and look.
20th.
It was the last June meeting. It was somewhere around June 20th. I don't remember the exact date.
All right, any other discussion? All right, all those in favor? All right,
Just to note, Jay,
yeah, go ahead.
sorry. Just to note, this is the second read, so that means it's adopted policy.
Correct, yep. All right, so now we're on to subcommittee reports, and first is policy subcommittee.
Right now?
So, no, so we had a meeting a week or so ago, and the three policies you just heard about were discussed there, but we had another policy that we spent probably more time on than these three that we're going to bring back to the next meeting around use of facilities by outside organizations and groups. And Brian actually got disconnected for about half of that due to a significant storm. So we have a lot of work still to do on that policy before we bring it forward. Mark, I don't know if you had anything to add to that. You were there. Brian, do you have anything to add on policy? See.
No, that's definitely the next discussion. There are a couple more in the queue after that, but I think the transgender one was probably the next one after that.
There was also,
But we may not get that far in just the next meeting.
and then there was one other one that I believe the guidance staff wanted to contribute on, but were unable to do so because of other commitments, so we tabled that. I assume that will be at the next meeting if they're available to participate.
Is that the IKE, the promotion and retention?
Yes. I think we've talked
Yeah.
about around that, finishing up some of these others and pulling that one in after we're done with these, because we'll probably not be using that one until later in the school year, so tackling some of these others first.
Fair enough.
All right, UTC?
We have a meeting coming up, so
All right, and then Spruce, our next meeting is on the 8th of November, so I will know more at that point. Curriculum Subcommittee?
We did meet, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, or was that last week? I know we meet on Thursdays. I remember, I forget which one it is. This one met last week. The bulk of the meeting, which I did leave a few minutes early, involved updates, in some cases from members who participated, but in some cases from Meredith in situations where there wasn't a representative there, of what the various curriculum subgroups had done during the most recent professional development day. And it sounds like there was a lot of good work done by all those groups, and good progress seems to be being made, in my view at least. So that's my quick and dirty summary.
All right, so next we're on to other business. Do we have any other business? All right, next, future agenda items. Anyone have anything they'd like to see? All right, any public comment? All right, seeing none. The date, time, and location of our next 2 meetings. The next is November 7th, here in the Town Council chambers at 6. Then we have one November 28th here in the Town Council chambers at 6. Angie, I have on the calendar, I have one on the 21st that I think that I didn't put in, but with the shared calendar. Did we originally have a meeting on the 21st, or do we have a meeting on the 21st of November?
I think we might have moved that because of the Thanksgiving, and that Wednesday is a holiday.
Do we know, and my only concern, and I'm not extremely tech savvy, but my calendar, like the items in a certain color, are ones that are done by, that you, I believe you set up on the calendar that I've synced with. So we might want to just check that on our calendar we don't show one on the 21st.
Jake, I'm trying to remember, November is typically when we do the superintendent evaluation. Sometimes we set up a backup meeting in case we think we need it.
Okay, so that's what that might be.
No.
I was just looking, I don't actually have the 21st on my calendar, but that may have been how that came up at some point.
Go ahead,
Actually,
Matt.
yeah, and then we have one on the 12th of December.
So on the,
Honestly,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think with the 28th and the 12th, we should be okay.
I think probably initially it was on the 21st when we first rolled out the calendar, because that would be the typical third Tuesday of the month, but we moved it. We were making some adjustments. And on the website under the board meeting dates, it does only have the 28th, not the 21st. So you just need to check the Google Calendar to make sure it's also syncing up right.
Okay, all right, so we're good there. So any request for information and follow-up? All right, hearing none. I'm sorry.
I'm looking at the next meeting schedule and realize that we don't obviously meet again until after applications for this facilities committee have to be in. They have to be in on November 1st. So I'm just wondering if Meredith notices that a particular slot doesn't have enough applicants for it, if she can kind of make sure to beat the bushes so we have enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to make sure that we've got enough people to fill the spots, so.
Well, and I can let all of you know as well if there's an area, particularly the ones for parent community, if there are areas, or we seem light on applications there, and you could also help me with that, with your community conversations.
Yeah, Meredith, maybe if you could just send us a list of the names who've applied. I don't think you need the whole applications, but a list of everybody who's applied for all the slots. I don't know, 3 days or 4 days before they're due, so that we could help recruit in areas that need recruiting.
Sure, that sounds like a good idea.
And going along with that, I think the other thing we need to do is, I think Becca and Ben need to decide which, if either of them is going to be to fill the student spot, and then if they're not, to kick in kind of the second phase of that, which is to announce to the students. And I'm assuming it will only be high school students, but maybe I shouldn't assume that. But whatever the student population is, if we need someone that's not one of our board reps, that gets out in a timely enough fashion to allow anyone who's interested to put their application together and get it in. Because I do think it's, I agree with Aaron, I think it's absolutely imperative we have a student on this, so.
So, given that, Becca, can you give this some consideration, and I'll reach out to you and Ben in a couple of days?
Yes, I can tell you now that I would be down for committing to it, but I can talk to Ben about it. See if
So that was positive, yes? Okay, sorry. Just want to make sure I'm interpreting that correctly.
Sorry.
Excellent.
Listen, I was picking up what you were putting down.
Yeah.
All right, so seeing no more requests for information and follow-up, I am going to make a motion to adjourn. I will second that. Is there any discussion? All those in favor? Thank you.